I will forever recall the evening when everything began to unravel. It was not loud nor was it dramatic, rather, it was disturbingly quiet, unsettlingly still. I distinctly remember being seated on the couch, the soft illumination from the lamp cascading over the photo frames adorning the wall. The images captured moments of us laughing together at family gatherings, vacations, and birthdays. To any passerby, our life appeared flawless. However, to me, it increasingly resembled a theatrical set, and I questioned the authenticity of the performance. He, Daniel, entered late once more. His tie was askew, and his voice carried that familiar blend of charm and fatigue, which he utilized to guard himself. "Long day," he remarked, depositing his briefcase by the entrance. Yet, I perceived it, the way he sidestepped my gaze. The vibration of his phone in his pocket prompted his hand to silence it with a reflexive haste. I yearned to trust him. I desired to believe in us. After all, this was the individual who once vowed to me the universe beneath a canopy of stars and proclaimed he would never allow any obstacle to come between us. The man upon whom I had constructed my world. Nevertheless, an inner voice urged me, remain vigilant. Thus, I did. In the subsequent weeks, the fissures broadened. Meetings that extended past midnight became the norm. Business trips emerged unexpectedly. An unfamiliar scent of cologne lingered on his jacket, definitely not his. I attempted to convince myself that I was merely indulging in unfounded suspicions, that love necessitates trust and trust demands patience. However, patience morphed into silence, and silence into suspicion. Then arrived the evening that transformed everything. I was in the process of setting the dining table for an intimate meal for two, his favorite pasta, the kind he often claimed surpassed any restaurant fare. My phone vibrated, and without contemplation, I answered. A message from an unknown sender illuminated the screen. It was not intended for me, it was directed towards him. For succinct words twisted my stomach in knots, "Can't wait for tonight." I was paralyzed. The spoon I held crashed against the countertop. My heart raced while my breathing grew shallow. I reread it multiple times, hoping the letters would rearrange into something benign, something I could rationalize. But they did not. At that moment, treachery entered my home, uninvited yet undeniable. I did not scream, I did not weep, not at that instant. Instead, I returned the phone to its former place, forced calmness onto my expression, and completed the table setting. When he arrived home that night, I greeted him with a smile. I served dinner and inquired about his day, feigning normalcy, all while the weight of his secret thundered within me, echoing the ominous prelude of a storm. I concluded, let him continue his charade. He remains oblivious to the fact that I have just discerned the parameters of his game. For the reality is, he presumed I would absolve him. He believed I would remain silent, swallowing the deceit, all the while maintaining the facade of our picturesque little set. Yet, what he was unaware of was that I was meticulously plotting my retribution. By the time I concluded, he would not merely forfeit my trust, he would lose everything he assumed he could conceal. The succeeding days were laden with weight, not due to spoken words, but rather due to the unspoken. Each smile he offered felt contrived, every justification bore the polish of rehearsed lines from a script he had practiced excessively. I too became an actress, nodding, listening, pretending, while my mind swirled with inquiries. Who was she? How long had their affair persisted? Did he ever genuinely mean the words he once confided in me when we were naive, believing that forever was simple? I began observing him with a newfound scrutiny. He believed he was astute, yet love had honed my instincts sharper than he anticipated. His phone rarely strayed from his side, even during his brief retreats to the restroom. The sudden onset of texting left his lips twitching into smiles that he did not share with me. The late-night calls he engaged in carried hushed tones, as he turned away from me, certain that walls could obscure the truth. One night, while he showered, I finally succumbed to temptation and seized the forbidden device, his phone. The screen illuminated, revealing not merely a number, but a name. Melissa. Her messages depicted a narrative I had never wished to comprehend. Last night was perfect. I miss your voice already. When will you tell her? My stomach churned with every message, yet my heart began to find an unsettling steadiness. This was no longer a figment of imagination, this was truth, inscribed in pixels that seared like flames. I should have confronted him, yet an inner voice counseled me to delay. Yes, the betrayal was profound, but my patience surpassed the weight of his fabrications. If I erupted in confrontation now, he would inevitably distort the reality, casting himself as the victim. No, I resolved. Allow him to deepen his own pit. Let him assume I remain oblivious, for when the veracity eventually crashes upon him, it will be his existence at stake, not mine, that crumbles. I started to recognize more signs. A restaurant charge on his credit card during a time he asserted he was working late. A hotel reservation that appeared illogical for a conference. A faint hint of perfume on his coat, floral, sharp, entirely distinct from the vanilla fragrance I wore. Each detail was another coffin nail in the trust one had once held dear. Yet, each evening, I maintained my facade. I prepared meals, I smiled, and I inquired about his day. I permitted him to lean in for a kiss, despite the lingering taste of treachery on his lips. Internally, I was a smoldering ember. The most challenging aspect was not the deceptions, it was the sheer audacity of his actions. He genuinely believed I would remain oblivious to his transgressions. He thought I would extend my forgiveness, as I had previously, over trivial errors, broken promises, and the minor fractures in our marriage that I mended with hope. Yet, this situation marked a departure from that pattern. This was no mere fissure, this represented a total disintegration. The night when I resolved my plan unfolded like countless others before it. He sat at the table, absorbed in his phone, chuckling at something he refused to share with me. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer gazing at my spouse but at a stranger masquerading in his likeness. And strangers do not receive forgiveness, they face repercussions. He believed he was crafting a narrative of clandestine affection and stolen moments. What he failed to realize was that I was drafting my own narrative, one of endurance, enlightenment, and a retribution so meticulous he would remain oblivious until the moment it was too late. Revenge is not manifested in a singular instant, it comes in pieces, akin to jigsaw fragments you collect until the overall picture becomes evident. That evening, after observing him laugh at his phone across from me, I laid awake in bed, fixated on the ceiling while he snored beside me, completely unaware. My heart ached, indeed, but more significantly, it burned with clarity. He mistakenly thought himself astute, but he had severely underestimated me. If he assumed I was blind, I would provide him with blindness. If he presumed I was feeble, I would gift him silence. And within that silence, I would construct a trap that would render him speechless. I initiated my plan subtly. I began attuning myself to his routines, not the ones he displayed, but those he presumed I overlooked. The occasions he contacted her, the excuses he fabricated, the fleeting moments he absconded. Each detail became a thread, and I commenced weaving them into an inescapable net. I began meticulously documenting everything: screenshots of messages, copies of receipts, whispers of truths clandestinely hidden where he would never anticipate finding them. He assumed his clandestine world was undetectable, yet I was fashioning a mirror that would ultimately reveal all that he sought to conceal. The most arduous part was feigning normalcy. Sitting across from him at dinner, I nodded while he regaled me with tales of clients and projects, fully aware that Melissa's name lingered on his lips. Witnessing him kiss me goodnight, his lips imbued with the essence of betrayal, demanded every ounce of self-restraint within me not to scream. But I refrained. Instead, I smiled, posed gentle inquiries, and played my part so flawlessly that he never suspected my true intentions. That was my weapon, his misplaced confidence. For arrogance blinds more swiftly than love ever could. One evening, when he declared he would be working late, I expressed my understanding. I kissed his cheek and watched him depart. Then I trailed him, my hands clenching the steering wheel tightly as I drove several cars behind, the city lights sprawling like a river of secrets. He did not head to the office. He made no attempt to do so. He drove to a secluded restaurant on the outskirts of town, and there she was as Melissa. I remained in my vehicle, my breath fogging the window, observing their shared laughter, her hand brushing against his arm as if I had never existed. At that moment, fury crystallized into determination. Merely knowing was insufficient. I required him to understand that I was aware. But not yet. The timing needed to be perfect, the audience must be present, and his falsehoods had to collapse in his own hands. I returned home that night before his arrival, poured myself a glass of wine, and inscribed a single sentence in my journal that anchored my spirit. He presumed I would pardon him, yet my revenge will leave him utterly speechless. From that point forward, every action, statement, and decision I made became a part of the scheme. I was no longer merely his wife. I was the silent tempest he never anticipated forming over his seemingly flawless existence. The morning I resolved to take my initial step against him mirrored every other morning we had shared throughout the years, which was precisely the idea. He descended the stairs, adjusting his tie, sipping his coffee, and discussing meetings, while I nodded as if nothing was amiss. Internally, however, my heart no longer raced with anxiety. It was steady and purposeful, akin to a drumbeat guiding me forth. I had discerned a crucial truth: the strongest weapon against a liar is to maintain an appearance of normalcy. When you create the illusion that life remains unchanged, they remain oblivious to the tempest brewing above them. That day, I did not confront him with fury. I did not weep or shout. Rather, I quietly initiated the first fissure in the wall of lies he had constructed around himself. After he left for work, I stationed myself at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began connecting the dots that had troubled me for weeks. The receipts, the charges, the hotel reservations, each piece of paper, each digital trace, constituted a faint whisper of truth, and when whispers amalgamate, they transform into a roar. My hands trembled initially, but not from fear, rather from the weight of what I was bearing. These were not mere transactions. They represented evidence. Evidence that I was not delusional, evidence that the affection I believed we shared was inadequate for him, evidence that his clandestine existence had been flourishing in the obscurity of our relationship. I could have confronted him with the facts then, demanding explanations, pleading for the truth. However, what good would that have achieved? He would refute it. He would distort the narrative. He would claim I was overreacting. I was acutely aware of his behavioral patterns. He had always been artful, consistently finding a way to extricate himself from predicaments. No, I reassured myself, not this time. This time, he would be unable to depend on his charm or excuses, for the truth would not reside solely in my possession, it would be disseminated among others. Thus, I initiated a call to his place of employment. My tone was composed, courteous, and cautious. I inquired about a specific payment and a hotel reservation, feigning the demeanor of a perplexed spouse managing administrative matters. The woman on the line was professional and gracious, assuring me she would investigate. I expressed gratitude and terminated the call, well aware that my preparations had commenced. While awaiting a reply, I further advanced my strategy. I crafted a digital footprint of my own, a seemingly innocent post on social media. A photograph of myself at a market beaming, accompanied by a caption that appeared cheerful and commonplace. Why? Because ordinary moments attract attention. When everything appears mundane on the surface, any cracks that emerge beneath seem more pronounced. I was intentionally creating contrast. I aimed to ensure that when the truth eventually surfaced, there would be no means for him to portray me as irrational or theatrical. I would be the composed nucleus. He would embody the disorder. Hours elapsed, and then the first sign of trouble arose. An email arrived from his organization, marked as urgent. Upon opening it, I was greeted with phrases such as expense discrepancies, documentation assessment, and irregular entries. They may have employed polite and professional language, but to me, they sounded like the awakening of justice. That evening, when he returned home, he appeared almost radiant, regaling me with tales of how a client had posed challenges, yet he had managed to resolve the situation. He kissed my cheek and inquired about dinner as if life were perfectly normal. And I smiled. I smiled because I was aware that inquiries had already commenced behind the doors of his office. His hidden life was no longer cloaked in invisibility. He had unwittingly become the subject of scrutiny, oblivious to the unfolding events. That night, while he rested, I accessed the drawer where I had concealed the file I had meticulously compiled. Inside lay everything: screenshots of his exchanges with Melissa, restaurant expenses, the hotel invoice, and even the photograph I captured of him with her through my car window on the night I followed him. I laid every document out on the table before me and gazed at it for an extended period. Each sheet of paper represented a piece of truth, collectively narrating a story so irrefutable that no rationalization could diminish it. I made duplicates. I organized everything systematically. I transformed betrayal into a coherent timeline, into something structured and undeniable. The following morning, with unwavering hands, I sent this dossier to an individual whom I believed would be significant, an old acquaintance from one of his company's charitable events, someone who had once assured me, "Should you require assistance, I am merely a call away." I refrained from accusations. I avoided rants. I simply stated, "I thought you ought to see this," and attached the timeline. It was not long before action was taken. Within a few hours, his company commenced an internal investigation. Quiet, discreet, but official. I could nearly sense the ripples traversing through his world while he remained oblivious to the tumult beneath the surface. Later that day, the phone rang. He answered, and I observed his expression as the voice on the other end uttered terms like irregularities, expenses, and clarification required. His hand quivered slightly as he lowered the phone. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, he met my gaze directly, but his eyes no longer betrayed confidence. They appeared searching, almost imploring, reminiscent of a man who suddenly comprehends the ground beneath him is unstable. That night, he attempted to dismiss the situation with laughter. He insisted it was merely a misunderstanding, that accountants often err, and that he would resolve the issue. I did not engage in argument. I did not level accusations. I served him tea, placed it gently before him, and remarked, "I am certain you will sort this out soon." The tranquility in my voice unsettled him far more than rage ever could. Subsequently, I slid one of the printed documents across the table, the hotel reservation marked with red highlights. His complexion faded. He picked it up, perused it once, twice, thrice, as if repetition could alter the reality. Then he regarded me and murmured, "How did you obtain this?" The inquiry was almost childlike, fragile. Not the voice of a confident man who had deceived me directly, but rather that of an individual beginning to recognize his entrapment. I refrained from providing a direct response. Instead, I stated, "We both understand its implications." His jaw clenched. He yearned to contest, yet the evidence was too meticulous, too unequivocal. I observed the frantic thoughts whirling in his mind, frantically seeking non-existent justifications. Then, with composure and intention, I reached for my phone and dialed his HR contact. I activated the speakerphone. He remained silent as the voice on the line detailed the inquiry, the required documents, and the verification process. To others, these phrases might have sounded mundane, but to him, they were like blades slicing through his final defenses. That evening, after the call concluded, he sat on the bed's edge, his head buried in his hands. For once, he refrained from offering explanations or even reaching out to me. He simply remained there, wordless, resembling a man who had finally confronted the reflection he had long evaded. As I observed him disintegrate under the burden of his decisions, I experienced something unanticipated, not joy, nor a sense of victory, but a profound and unwavering tranquility. The reality was no longer solely mine to bear, it was now exposed to the world, irrefutable, and he could no longer indulge in pretense. The following days unfolded with a cadence that only I perceived, akin to a concealed drumbeat propelling me onward while he struggled to maintain his composure. Externally, nothing appeared altered. He continued to depart for work at 8, exchanged kisses with me at the door, and walked away with the same assured demeanor he had exhibited for years. Yet, I recognized an alteration had occurred, as the previous night, I had discerned a flicker of fear in his eyes, the initial realization that the barriers surrounding him were not as formidable as he had believed. Fear operates in peculiar ways. Initially, it conceals itself, masquerading as irritation, anger, or denial. He assured me he would manage the situation, claiming that the HR department was overreacting and that mistakes in paperwork are commonplace. However, I observed his hand tapping restlessly upon the table while stating this, the rise in pitch of his voice, and the way he averted his gaze instead of meeting mine. These were the fissures, minor, perhaps unnoticed by others, yet to me, a keen observer, they were blatant and indisputable. I refrained from confronting him. I did not hurry. Instead, I embraced the power of silence, which I discovered to be more resonant than words in the face of someone unraveling. I prepared meals, kept the house tidy, responded when addressed, but provided nothing further, no warmth, no comfort, no assurance. This silence transformed into a reflective surface, casting back at him the emptiness of his justifications. As the week progressed, the tempest he believed he could manage began to widen. The first call arrived late at night. He answered it in the kitchen, his voice a hushed murmur, pacing with his back turned towards me. Yet, I gleaned enough: policy violation, external review, suspension pending clarification. He swiftly ended the call, but the flush coloring his cheeks and the perspiration on his brow spoke volumes. He muttered some expletives about annoying bureaucracy as he poured himself a drink. I did not intervene, I merely observed, my silence heavier than any accusation could convey. 2 days later, another domino toppled. His credit card was declined during our dinner. He dismissed it with a laugh, attributing it to the bank or a technical glitch. However, I was well aware, I had previously contacted the bank earlier that week to freeze specific accounts under the guise of suspected fraudulent activity. I hardly needed to fabricate anything, his dubious transactions sufficed. He regarded me across the table, attempting to decipher my expression, but all he encountered was serene composure. Such calmness unsettles a guilty individual. It gives the impression that the adversary is already aware of the conclusion, that the verdict has been predetermined pre-trial. That evening, after he succumbed to sleep, I perched by the window with my notebook at hand, contemplating the subsequent step. Revenge does not embody fury, anger is disordered. Rather, revenge manifests as patience cloaked in strategy. I had ensured that not only was his company scrutinizing him, but that rumors had begun to circulate beyond those confines. A discreet remark here, a carefully positioned comment there, sufficient for select individuals, mutual acquaintances, former colleagues, to begin connecting the dots independently. Nothing disseminates faster than suspicion masquerading as gossip. By Friday, the flawless facade he had crafted from charm and deceit was no longer impervious. The calls grew more frequent, his office door remained closed more often. His laughter, once unrestrained and vibrant, became forced and hollow. He began to snap over trivial matters: how I folded the laundry, the seasoning of dinner, or the unopened mail on the counter. Nevertheless, I refrained from retaliating. I permitted him to flounder, to press against an impenetrable wall. For the reality is, the more a liar grapples, the deeper into quicksand they become ensnared. On Saturday morning, I discovered him seated at the dining table far earlier than his usual hour. His tie was absent, his coffee untouched, and his phone face down, vibrating intermittently with notifications he chose to ignore. For an extended period, he remained silent, merely gazing at the table's wood grain, seemingly seeking answers inscribed therein. Eventually, he raised his gaze to meet mine and remarked, "You have changed." His tone was flat, nearly accusatory. I inclined my head, feigning perplexity, though internally, I comprehended his intentions with clarity. Essentially, he was implying, "You are not providing the responses I seek. You are neither displaying distress nor resisting, you remain unbroken." This is the very expectation of deceivers, that their victims will react with rage or dissolve into tears, thereby granting the deceiver room to retreat into defense or claim victimhood. However, when a victim maintains a state of tranquility and steadfastness, the liar is stripped of authority. This realization instilled fear within him, though he lacked the words to articulate it. I refrained from responding to his accusation. Instead, I placed a folder on the table. He approached it cautiously, almost apprehensive of its contents. Upon opening it, his complexion paled visibly. Inside were duplicates of his communications with Melissa, receipts, the hotel bill, and a printed version of the company's formal investigation notice received by mail. He reviewed the documents methodically, each page weighing heavier than the last, until his hands trembled too excessively to proceed. He allowed the folder to fall and murmured, "You do not comprehend. It is not as it appears." Yet I remained silent, my demeanor unwavering, my serenity pressing upon him more forcefully than any argument could. Breaking the silence anew, his voice quivered, "Please, just hear me out." It was then that I recognized the complete reversal of power. He was no longer the custodian of secrets. He had become the supplicant, striving to convince, unraveling before my eyes. Meanwhile, I had transitioned from the aggrieved spouse holding shattered remnants to the one reflecting his deceptions back at him, enabling him to witness his own disintegration. In the ensuing days, the situation grew increasingly constricted. His employer suspended him pending a full investigation. Friends, once eager to share laughter and drinks, ceased to return his calls. Melissa, too, disappeared, leaving behind unanswered texts, an illustration of how betrayal seldom accompanies loyalty. Through all of this, I remained composed, tranquil, untouchable. He traversed the house like a specter, seeking an anchor, a sign of forgiveness or hope. Yet, each time his gaze met mine, he encountered only silence. A silence that revealed an undeniable truth: his existence was collapsing, and I would not come to his aid. He had spent weeks fearing that the most devastating consequence would be exposure at his workplace, losing his position, his reputation, perhaps a few friendships. But he had never fathomed the manner in which truth could dismantle the private realm he had constructed, our home, our life, the facade he projected to others. I recognized that the final act required more than professional ramifications. It had to be profoundly personal, compelling him to confront what he had taken and to feel, in a subtle yet irrevocable manner, the void he had created. I orchestrated it like a conductor positioning the concluding, pivotal note of a symphony. The day unfolded similarly to any typical day, and this was intentional. I donned nothing excessive, merely a straightforward dress signaling my continuity in life. He observed my preparations from the doorway, his eyes haggard from insomnia, and inquired about my destination. I replied, simply going for a walk. This was only partially accurate. I drove to a location of shared significance, an old park bench beneath the willow tree where we had once exchanged promises we believed would endure eternally. I sat there for an extended period, observing the world move on, ruminating on the small promises that had silently eroded our life. Subsequently, I paid visits to individuals whose perspectives mattered in various respects: friends, neighbors, those who had previously admired us as a couple. I did not cast accusations nor plead for sympathy. I merely presented them with the timeline I had constructed and recounted the events that had transpired in measured, truthful terms. I observed disbelief transition into concern, which evolved into inquiries. Some individuals distanced themselves, burdened by their discomfort. Others drew nearer, offering subdued support. Each response was a deliberate contribution to the mosaic I was creating. This endeavor was not driven by spectacle, but by the truth seeking fertile ground for growth. Later that afternoon, I invited a select group of individuals to a modest gathering, disguised as a casual dinner, a modest affair to reconnect, I asserted, nothing extraordinary. They attended because they had faith in me, because we had shared enjoyable moments together. Daniel, right until the final moment, believed it to be an ordinary evening. He prepared the meal with unease, sent awkward messages to friends inquiring about their tardiness, and paced restlessly as though awaiting a decision that had yet to be revealed. The aroma of roasting garlic and rosemary filled the house, an old-fashioned domesticity concealing the undercurrent of what awaited. I had requested everyone to bring a small item to share food, anecdotes, a bottle of wine. However, I refrained from informing them that I had prepared a straightforward slideshow on my laptop, a neutral presentation designed to narrate a story that would unfold without my direct intervention. I had organized the room in such a manner that when individuals convened, the screen would be positioned in a place to which they would instinctively turn their gaze. Upon the arrival of the guests, embraces were shared, light conversations flowed throughout the spaces, and Daniel settled into a facade of normality. For a fleeting moment, as I observed him share laughter with former colleagues, I experienced a flicker of the old warmth, a remnant of times gone by. Yet, that warmth had transformed into a mere recollection, devoid of life. Following dinner, as everyone situated themselves with coffee, I rose and proposed that we view some photographs from our travels, a seemingly innocuous suggestion intended to facilitate a smooth transition. I dimmed the lights and, with a soft click, initiated the slideshow. The initial images were recognizable: vacations, birthdays, and cheerful faces. Light laughter emerged from the crowd as they leaned into nostalgia. However, as the slideshow unfolded, the images subtly evolved. Alongside pictures of us at the seaside, I incorporated screenshots of message threads, credit card statements, and booking confirmations, documents that attested to a concurrent existence. I opted to display the evidence visually because images and documentation possess an uncanny ability to circumvent rational defenses. They resonate directly where justifications cannot penetrate. The atmosphere in the room shifted to silence. Conversations were abruptly interrupted. I observed as his expression transitioned from amusement to confusion, ultimately draining of color. He struggled to rise, to reach for the remote, to turn off the laptop, but a nearby friend, whom I knew to respond with poise, gently took the remote and allowed the slideshow to continue uninterrupted. I permitted it to persist. I noted how his hands trembled slightly as images he presumed private illuminated the screen for all to witness. I perceived his mouth form unspoken words. I noticed his attempts to smile fail. No one erupted in anger. No one hurled insults. There was no dramatic spectacle nor loud downfall. Rather, the atmosphere became so dense that it felt as though the very air held its breath. People regarded him differently, not with immediate condemnation, but with the gradual realization of a dawning truth. Friends shifted in their seats, exchanging meaningful glances. A woman who had once esteemed him lowered her gaze and touched her face in shock. A man who had previously been his mentor clasped his hands, his eyes narrowed in disappointment. Upon the conclusion of the last slide, I powered down the laptop and faced the assembly. My voice remained unwavering as I recounted the narrative I had borne, succinct, factual statements that permitted their own contemplations. I neither raised my voice nor dramatized the situation. I conveyed what had transpired, what I had discovered, and the actions taken by the company. I shared how I had observed him once, detailing my findings and how I had constructed the timeline. My discourse was not intended as a means of revenge, as one might envision, characterized by flamboyance and shouting. Instead, it aimed at reclaiming truth and imploring those who mattered to acknowledge it. In response, some guests rose, approached me, and offered embraces. Others departed quietly, unable to remain in a space that had transformed into a scrutiny chamber for someone they had once trusted. Daniel sat in a state of paralysis, appearing as though the ground had been pulled from beneath him. His eyes flitted toward those he had relied upon, seeking solace, yet finding none. The silence elongated until a voice, soft, nearly inaudible, inquired about his thoughts. He parted his lips, closed them, and ultimately conjured a series of excuses that were so familiar they felt rehearsed even to me. He attempted to reframe receipts as business-related expenses, and text messages as professional banter. With every word, his credibility diminished. The more he endeavored to manipulate the narrative, the more ensnared he became in his own justifications. Such was the harsh reality of evidence. It requires no volume, it merely demands coherence. Upon his conclusion, I stood and stated, with calmness, I wished for individuals you know, those who have witnessed your best, to recognize the truth. I did not gloat. I did not aim to humiliate. I allowed the truth to undertake that responsibility. The room murmured. Some individuals chose to exit at that instant, some shook his hand hesitantly, while others remained to engage in candid conversation. He was no longer the individual able to charm his way out of repercussions. He had been exposed, and revelation transforms the perception even of one's oldest allies. After the guests departed and the house settled into evening, he requested that I remain, to converse, to hear explanations that were increasingly devoid of substance. He professed his love, acknowledged his error, and pledged to terminate the situation. I listened as any strategic plan necessitates provision for human moments. He was, after all, the progenitor of my future aspirations had we chosen an alternative route. However, I had contemplated the future thoroughly. I recognized that forgiveness is not a simplistic toggle, it must be earned, reconstructed, and entirely genuine. He assured me he would sever ties, that he would resign if needed, and would make reparations. A part of me wished to indulge him in that moment, to allow the previous tenderness to resurface. Nevertheless, I was aware enough to recognize that words alone offered only a superficial facade. Underlying actions would need to validate them. Therefore, I established the ultimate stipulation akin to a quiet decree, acknowledgement by the public, professional counseling, and an acceptance of the repercussions at work. He acquiesced in that moment, as agreement is frequently a readily offered commodity by a man in dire straits. However, I was acutely aware that commitments made under pressure are prone to dissipate once the audience departs. This awareness is precisely why my concluding action extended beyond merely the presentation. It encompassed the reconfiguration of our shared existence in order to safeguard myself and mandate accountability. I sought legal guidance to comprehend my alternatives, not out of malice toward him, but to establish a protective perimeter. Furthermore, I communicated with friends who could assist in creating a safeguard against potential repercussions. I initiated practical adjustments, such as the separation of financial accounts and discussions regarding our living situations, so that, should he genuinely desire to reform, he would be required to actively rebuild trust from the ground up. He implored me to pardon him that evening, his voice quivering and eyes glistening. I conveyed that forgiveness is not instantaneous. It is a commodity earned through continuous truthfulness. That response devastated him more profoundly than any public disgrace could have, for it indicated there existed a pathway forward, albeit one that would be prolonged, uncertain, and contingent upon attributes he had yet to prove capable of providing. As the night wore on, he exited the room to slumber on the sofa, vanquished in a manner I had never witnessed before. I remained solitary for an extended period, devoid of a sense of triumph, yet enveloped in something more subdued, a weighty, persistent relief. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life. I transformed secrecy into transparency, thereby regaining a fragment of myself that had been relinquished incrementally. My pursuit of retribution was never intended to inflict suffering for its own sake. Rather, it aimed to restore equilibrium to a life that had been distorted by falsehoods. The concluding act consisted of illuminating the obscured aspects of our existence and inviting observers to bear witness. It succeeded, not by decimating him in a display, but by necessitating that both he and I now exist in the illumination of what had transpired.